The city that never sleeps was living up to its name, but inside studio, something extraordinary was happening that nobody was supposed to witness. A 21-year-old studio engineer named Marcus Chun was finishing his graveyard shift, cleaning up after a long day of recording sessions, when he heard a sound that would change his understanding of greatness forever. It was 3 in the morning, and the studio was supposed to be empty. But coming from a main recording booth was a voice so pure, so powerful, that Marcus dropped the cable he was coiling and stood frozen in complete awe. Whitney Houston was in there, alone, singing the same 8 bars over and over again with an intensity that made the hair on his arms stand up. But this wasn't a scheduled session. This wasn't a performance. This was something Marcus was never supposed to see, the hidden side of genius that the world never witnesses. What happened in the next 40 minutes would reveal the truth about what it really takes to be legendary. And the moment Whitney caught him listening would teach Marcus a lesson about greatness that no music school could ever provide. If you want to discover the untold moments that separate good artists from legends, hit that subscribe button right now, because this story will show you the 10,000 hours nobody sees. Marcus Chun had dreamed of working in music production since he was 13 years old, growing up in Queens listening to his mother's Whitney Houston cassettes on repeat. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to support the family, would play Whitney's music during their rare moments together. Those songs became the soundtrack to Marcus's childhood, a symbol of excellence and beauty in a world that often felt overwhelming. After graduating from Berklee College of Music with massive student loan debt, Marcus had landed what he thought was his dream job as an assistant engineer at Hit Factory Studios. But the reality of the music industry had been brutally different from his expectations. For 6 months, his job had consisted of coffee runs, cable organization, and endless hours of tedious technical work that had nothing to do with the creative magic he'd imagined. By November 1998, Marcus was seriously questioning whether he'd made a terrible mistake pursuing music. The glamour he'd expected had been replaced by exhaustion. The creative collaboration he'd dreamed of had been replaced by cleanup duty, and the financial security he'd hoped for was non-existent. His student loans were crushing him, his tiny apartment in Brooklyn barely had heat, and he was working graveyard shifts just to make rent. The night of November 12th started like any other late shift. Marcus had been assigned to clean and reset studio after a marathon recording session for Whitney Houston's upcoming album, My Love Is Your Love. The official session had wrapped at 11 p.m., with Whitney leaving alongside her producers and vocal coaches. Marcus had watched her walk out, looking exhausted but professional, surrounded by her entourage. He'd been too intimidated to even make eye contact. For the next 3 hours, Marcus went through his routine. He organized cables, cleaned the mixing board, reset microphone positions, and prepared the studio for the next day's sessions. The work was mind-numbing, but it paid slightly better than day shifts, and the solitude gave him time to think about whether he should just quit and find a regular job that actually paid the bills. It was 2:47 a.m. when Marcus heard the door to Studio A open. He froze, wondering if security was doing rounds or if he'd somehow missed a scheduled late-night session. But when he peeked around the corner from the equipment room, he saw something that made his heart skip. Whitney Houston had returned to the studio, alone. She wasn't dressed like the polished superstar who had left hours earlier. She wore simple sweatpants, an oversized Howard University hoodie, and her hair was pulled back in a casual ponytail. She carried no entourage, no assistants, no producers. Just Whitney and a worn leather notebook. Marcus's first instinct was to announce his presence, to explain that he was just finishing cleanup. But something stopped him. There was something intensely private about the way Whitney moved through the studio, something that told him she had come here specifically because she thought she was alone. She entered the recording booth, put on the headphones, and stood at the microphone for a long moment with her eyes closed. Marcus watched from the shadows of the equipment room, barely breathing, as Whitney began to sing. What came out her mouth wasn't the polished, perfect Whitney Houston that the world knew. It was raw, vulnerable, searching. She was working through a melody, trying different approaches, stopping and starting, critiquing herself in ways that were almost painful to hear. This wasn't performance. This was practice. This was work. This was the part of greatness that nobody ever sees. For the next 20 minutes, Marcus remained completely still in the equipment room, watching through the small window as Whitney Houston did something he'd never imagined superstars did. She was practicing the same 8 bars of song over and over, and with each repetition, she was making tiny adjustments that most people would never even notice. A slight change in breath control here, a different emotional emphasis there, a subtle variation in tone that transformed the entire feeling of the phrase. What struck Marcus most wasn't the beauty of her voice, though it was breathtaking even in this raw form. What shocked him was how hard she was working. This was Whitney Houston, arguably the greatest voice of her generation, and she was laboring over these 8 bars with an intensity that suggested she was fighting for her life. Between takes, she would speak to herself, sometimes encouraging, sometimes critical. Marcus could hear fragments through the slightly opened door. No, that's not honest enough. Find the truth in it, Whitney. Stop trying to be perfect and just feel it. The vulnerability in those private moments was staggering. Marcus had always assumed that talent like Whitney's was effortless, a gift from God that simply flowed out whenever she opened her mouth. But watching her work, he realized he'd been completely wrong. This wasn't effortless. This was exhausting. This was the result of thousands of hours of work that happened in moments exactly like this, when nobody was watching and nobody would ever know. Around 3:15 a.m., Whitney stopped singing and sat down on the floor of the recording booth, her back against the wall, her head in her hands. Marcus could see her shoulders shaking and realized with shock that she was crying. Not dramatic, performative crying, but the quiet, exhausted tears of someone who had been pushing themselves beyond their limits. He wanted to leave, to give her privacy, but he was trapped. If he moved now, she would definitely hear him, and the embarrassment of being discovered would be unbearable for both of them. So he remained frozen, feeling like an intruder in a moment that was never meant to be witnessed. After a few minutes, Whitney wiped her eyes, stood up, and did something that surprised Marcus even more than the tears. She picked up the phone in the recording booth and made a call. At 3 a.m, Marcus couldn't hear most of the conversation, but he caught fragments. "Mama, I know it's late." A long pause. "I can't get it right. I can hear it in my head, but it's not coming out right." Another pause, longer this time. I know you're proud of me, but I'm not proud of this yet." Whitney's mother, Sissy Houston, was on the other end of that call. Marcus knew enough about Whitney's background to understand the significance. Sissy was herself a legendary gospel and soul singer, Whitney's first and most important teacher. The fact that Whitney was calling her mother at 3 a.m, seeking guidance and reassurance, revealed a layer of vulnerability that completely contradicted the confident superstar image the world saw. When Whitney hung up, she stood in silence for a long moment, then picked up her notebook and wrote something down. Marcus watched as she read whatever she'd written several times, nodded to herself, and returned to the microphone. What happened next would be seared into Marcus's memory forever. Whitney positioned herself at the microphone and closed her eyes. The change in her presence was immediate and profound. Something had shifted during that phone call with her mother, during those quiet moments of writing in her notebook. When she began to sing again, it was transformed. The same 8 bars she'd been struggling with for the past 30 minutes now flowed out of her with an authenticity and power that made Marcus's eyes fill with tears. This was it. This was the moment when all that work, all that struggle, all those private hours of practice crystallized into something transcendent. The technical precision was still there, but now it was serving something deeper, an emotional truth that couldn't be faked or manufactured. Whitney sang through the entire section 3 times, each take building on the last, and by the 3rd repetition, Marcus understood what she'd been searching for. She hadn't been trying to sing it perfectly. She'd been trying to sing it honestly. When she finished, Whitney stood at the microphone for a long moment, breathing heavily, then smiled. Not the public smile that graced magazine covers, but a private, satisfied smile that said she'd finally found what she was looking for. That's when Marcus made his critical mistake. Overcome with emotion and without thinking, he began to clap. The sound echoed through the studio, and Whitney's head snapped toward the equipment room where Marcus was hiding. Her expression shifted instantly from satisfaction to shock to something that looked almost like fear. She thought she was alone, and now she realized someone had been watching her most vulnerable moments. Marcus's heart sank as he realized what he'd done. He'd violated her privacy, witnessed moments she'd never intended anyone to see, and now there was no way to undo it. He stepped out of the equipment room, his face burning with embarrassment and shame. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I was just finishing cleanup, and you came in, and I didn't know what to do, and I should have said something, but then it seemed too late, and I'm so sorry, Miss Houston. I'll leave right now." Whitney stood in the recording booth, her hands still on the microphone, studying him with an expression Marcus couldn't read. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 seconds. "How long were you there?" she finally asked, her voice neutral. Marcus swallowed hard. "About 40 minutes. From when you first came in." "I'm sorry." Another long silence. Then Whitney did something unexpected. She smiled, not with anger or embarrassment, but with what looked almost like relief. "What's your name?" Marcus blinked, confused by the gentle tone. "Marcus Chun. I'm an assistant engineer. Night shift." Whitney removed her headphones and stepped out of the recording booth. "Marcus Chun, tell me something. Marcus, what did you think of what you saw?" Marcus didn't know how to answer. The truth seemed too personal, too revealing. But something in Whitney's expression told him that this moment mattered, that his answer mattered. "I thought," he began carefully, "that I've been doing this wrong." Whitney tilted her head, curious. "What have you been doing wrong?" Marcus took a breath, feeling the words tumble out before he could stop them. "I've been waiting to feel talented. I've been waiting for it to be easy. I thought people like you, people with real gifts, just had it naturally. But watching you work, I realized that's not how it works at all. You're the greatest singer in the world, and you were in here at 3 in the morning, crying, struggling, working harder than I've ever worked at anything. And I realized I'm not failing because I lack talent. I'm failing because I lack your work ethic." Whitney was quiet for a long moment, then walked over to where Marcus stood and sat down on one of the studio chairs, gesturing for him to sit as well. What happened next, Marcus would later say, changed the entire trajectory of his life. "Can I tell you something that nobody knows?" Whitney asked. "Something I don't talk about in interviews or with most people in the industry?" Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. "I have terrible imposter syndrome," Whitney said quietly. "Every single time I step up to a microphone, there's a voice in my head telling me that this will be the time everyone figures out I'm a fraud, that I got lucky, that my success was an accident." Marcus stared at her in disbelief. "But you're Whitney Houston. You've sold over 100 million records. Your voice it's perfect." Whitney laughed, but it was a sad sound. "My voice is an instrument, Marcus. And like any instrument, it requires constant maintenance, constant practice, constant work. The world sees the performances, the award shows, the music videos. They don't see this, the 3 a.m. sessions, the struggle, the doubt. And that's exactly how it should be. The audience shouldn't have to see the work. But people in this industry, young people like you, need to understand something crucial." She leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Talent is the smallest part of what makes someone successful. The smallest part. You know what matters more? Showing up. Consistency. Being willing to do the work when nobody's watching and nobody will ever know. Being willing to fail privately 1,000 times to succeed publicly once." Marcus felt something shift inside him as Whitney continued. "You said you thought people like me have it naturally, but let me tell you what naturally really means. It means I was born with certain physical gifts, vocal cords that happen to work well, lung capacity that's above average. That's genetics. That's luck. But everything else, everything that makes me Whitney Houston instead of just another person who can carry a tune, that's work. That's 10,000 hours of practice nobody sees. That's nights like tonight when I'm in here alone, struggling, crying, calling my mama for help." She stood up and walked back toward the recording booth, then turned to face Marcus. "You want to know what separates people who make it from people who don't in this business? It's not talent. The world is full of talented people who never amount to anything. It's not even luck, though luck helps. It's being willing to be in the studio at 3 in the morning when you could be sleeping, working on 8 bars that most people won't even consciously notice. It's being willing to be mediocre before you can be great. Most people aren't willing to do that. Their ego won't let them be bad at something long enough to get good at it." Marcus felt tears running down his face, though he hadn't realized he'd started crying. Everything Whitney was saying resonated with a part of him that had been questioning, doubting, wondering if he belonged in this world. "Can I ask you something?" he said. Whitney nodded. "When does it stop feeling so hard? When you get to the point where you're confident, where you don't doubt yourself?" Whitney's laugh was genuine this time. "Marcus, I'm 35 years old. I've been doing this professionally since I was 19. I won more Grammys than I can remember. And I'm still in here at 3 in the morning, doubting every choice, calling my mother for reassurance, cry because I can't get 8 bars to feel right. It never stops feeling hard. You just get better at doing it anyway." She walked over to a cabinet and pulled out 2 bottles of water, handing one to Marcus. "Let me tell you something my mother told me when I was about your age, just starting out. She said, 'Whitney, great artists aren't born. They're built through 10,000 hours nobody sees. And if you're not willing to put in those hours, to do the work when nobody's watching and nobody will ever give you credit for it, then you're in the wrong business.'" Whitney sat back down, taking a long drink of water. "So that's what you witnessed tonight, Marcus. You saw some of those invisible hours. The hours that don't make it to magazine covers or award shows. The hours where I'm not Whitney Houston, the superstar. I'm just a woman trying to get 8 bars to tell the truth." Marcus sat in silence, absorbing everything Whitney had said. The cramped apartment, the student loans, the endless nights of tedious work, all of it suddenly seemed different. Not easier, but more meaningful. He hadn't been failing. He'd been learning. He hadn't been wasting time. He'd been putting in his own invisible hours. "Can I tell you something?" Marcus asked. Whitney nodded. 6 months ago, I thought working here would be glamorous. I thought I'd be working with stars, learning from genius producers, doing creative work every day. Instead, I've been organizing cables, making coffee runs, cleaning studios at 3 in the morning. I've been thinking I made a mistake coming here. But watching you tonight, I realize I've had it backwards. This isn't the boring part before the real work begins. This is the real work. The cables, the cleanup, the technical details nobody notices, that's all part of the 10,000 hours. Whitney smiled, and this time it reached her eyes. "Now you're getting it. You know what most people don't understand about this industry? The glamour is the smallest part. The red carpets, the award shows, the magazine covers, that's maybe 1% of what we do. The other 99% is this. It's practice rooms. It's technical work. It's showing up day after day, even when you feel like you're getting nowhere. Every successful person you admire, every artist whose work moves you, they all paid the same price. They just paid it privately." She stood up and stretched. "You know what? I was planning to work for another hour, but I think we both need to get some sleep. But Marcus, before you go, I want to tell you something important." Whitney walked over to where Marcus stood and put her hand on his shoulder. "You're at a crossroads right now. You can leave this industry, convince yourself that you weren't cut out for it, that the struggle means you're failing. Or you can embrace the struggle, understand that this is exactly what success looks like in its unglamorous form, and keep showing up. But here's what I want you to understand. The choice you make now will determine everything." Marcus felt the weight of her words settling over him. "How do I know if I'm good enough?" he asked, voicing the fear that had been haunting him for months. Whitney's expression softened. "That's the wrong question, Marcus. The question isn't whether you're good enough. The question is whether you're willing to work long enough to become good enough. Natural talent gives you a head start. But this," she gestured around the studio, "this is where everyone has to do the same work. The only difference between people who make it and people who don't is that people who make it don't quit during the hard part." She walked to the door, then turned back. "You know what my mother taught me when I was young and struggling with self-doubt? She said, 'Whitney, the world doesn't need another perfect performer. The world needs authentic artists who are willing to be imperfect in pursuit of something true.' That's what I was doing tonight, Marcus. I wasn't trying to be perfect. I was trying to be true. And that's harder than perfection could ever be." As Whitney prepared to leave, Marcus found his voice one more time. "Ms. Houston, thank you. Not just for the advice, but for letting me see this. For not being angry that I witnessed something private." Whitney smiled. "Marcus, you gave me a gift tonight, too. You reminded me why I do this. Sometimes when you're famous, you forget that the struggle is universal. You start to think your problems are unique, that nobody understands the pressure. But watching your face tonight as I talked, seeing your recognition, your understanding, that reminded me that we're all in this together. Everyone who's ever tried to create something meaningful has felt what you're feeling. The doubt, the exhaustion, the questioning. You're not alone in this. She opened the door, then paused. And Marcus? What you witnessed tonight, this conversation, let's keep it between us. The world doesn't need to know about my 3 a.m. practice sessions, but you needed to see one. So take what you learned tonight and use it. Put in your 10,000 hours. Do the work nobody sees. And maybe someday, you'll be the one inspiring some young kid who's watching from the shadows. As Whitney prepared to leave, Marcus found his voice one more time. Ms. Houston, thank you. Not just for the advice, but for letting me see this. For not being angry that I witnessed something private. Whitney smiled. Marcus, you gave me a gift tonight too. You reminded me why I do this. Sometimes when you're famous, you forget that the struggle is universal. You start to think your problems are unique, that nobody understands the pressure. But watching your face tonight as I talked, seeing your recognition, your understanding, that reminded me that we're all in this together. Everyone who's ever tried to create something meaningful has felt what you're feeling. The doubt, the exhaustion, the questioning. You're not alone in this. She opened the door, then paused. And Marcus? What you witnessed tonight, this conversation, let's keep it between us. The world doesn't need to know about my 3 a.m. practice sessions, but you needed to see one. So take what you learned tonight and use it. Put in your 10,000 hours. Do the work nobody sees. And maybe someday, you'll be the one inspiring some young kid who's watching from the shadows. His mentors at Hit Factory noticed the change immediately. Within 6 months, Marcus was promoted from assistant engineer to junior engineer. Within 2 years, he was working on major label projects. Within 5 years, he had his own production credits on several successful albums. But the most important change wasn't in his resume. It was in his mindset. Marcus never forgot the lesson of that November night. Whenever he felt frustrated with the pace of his progress, whenever he doubted his abilities, whenever success seemed impossibly far away, he remembered Whitney Houston at 3 in the morning, crying over 8 bars, calling her mother, doing the work that nobody would ever see. Years later, when Marcus had established himself as a successful producer, he would mentor young engineers coming up in the industry. And he would tell them, often without explaining the full context, great artists aren't born. They're built through 10,000 hours nobody sees. And if you're not willing to put in those hours, to do the work when nobody's watching and nobody will ever give you credit for it, then you're in the wrong business. He never broke his promise to Whitney. He never told anyone about that night, never used her name in his mentoring stories, never revealed the source of his most important lesson. It remained a private gift, a sacred moment that belonged only to him. In 2009, when Marcus heard the news that Whitney Houston had passed away, he was in his own studio, working late into the night on a project. He stopped everything, went into the recording booth, and sat in silence for an hour, remembering that November morning in 1998. Remembering a woman who had been kind to a struggling kid when she didn't have to be. Remembering the words that had changed his life. The world mourned Whitney Houston, the superstar, the voice, the icon. But Marcus mourned the woman who had taught him that greatness isn't about talent or fame. It's about showing up at 3 in the morning when nobody's watching and doing the work anyway. It's about being willing to struggle, to doubt, to call your mother for help, and then getting back up and trying again. It's about the 10,000 hours nobody sees. Marcus attended Whitney's memorial service along with thousands of others who had been touched by her music. But he knew something they didn't. He knew that the woman they were celebrating wasn't great because she had an incredible gift. She was great because she had worked harder than anyone could imagine to honor that gift. As he listened to the tributes and watched the performances, Marcus thought about a conversation nobody else knew about. A lesson given in a recording studio at 3 in the morning, and a woman who had reminded him that authentic greatness is built in private moments of struggle that the world never sees. Today, when young artists come to Marcus's studio, they often comment on a quote he has framed on the wall. It simply says, "Great artists aren't born. They're built through 10,000 hours nobody sees." When they ask him where the quote comes from, he smiles and says, "From someone who lived it." And in his heart, he says a silent thank you to Whitney Houston, who taught him that lesson on a November morning in 1998 when she was willing to let a struggling kid see behind the curtain and witness what greatness really looks like. This incredible story reminds us all that the success we admire in others isn't magic. It's not luck. It's not even talent. It's work. It's showing up when nobody's watching. It's crying in private and trying again. It's calling for help when you need it and then getting back to the struggle. Whitney Houston, one of the greatest voices in human history, spent her 3 a.m. hours the same way every other successful person does. Working, struggling, growing. Who in your life needs to hear this message today? Share this video with someone who's doubting themselves, who's struggling, who thinks success should feel easier. If this story changed how you think about greatness, hit that like button and let us know in the comments. Subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have more stories that reveal the truth behind the legends. Until next time, remember that your invisible hours matter. The work nobody sees is building something the world will eventually celebrate.